Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Starting to feel like summer is coming to a close? Well, dread not the cold weather. The terror continues anyway. So, grab your sleeping bag and one hell of a warm coat. It's going to be one cold-hearted night at the lake. The cold silence of the Black Woods.
The forest boomed with a distant noise. It wasn't the typical woodland sounds of birds or midsummer's day insects. It was the unnatural wailing of a distant scream. A screaming that refused to subside and pleaded for release. Whoever was yelling was most certainly in an insurmountable amount of pain. Leslie ran as fast as he could, progressing ever closer to the source of the sound. His large adult limbs clumsily fumbled on the forest floor, trying to support his movements as he traversed the large boulders and fallen trees that littered the downhill landscape. Leslie didn't know why, but he felt an ever-increasing need to locate the source of the screaming. He was so determined, he didn't even hesitate as the light of day seemed to fade into twilight, and the trunks of the surrounding trees grew black. Moments later, Leslie had come upon an old Ford set ablaze. The trunk smashed in, as if it had crashed into the tree it was butted up against. The screaming had also reached its crescendo, apparently coming from within the crumpled trunk, signified by the panicked banging within. Leslie froze in horror. A paralyzing sense of dread washed over him as he stared intently at the raging flames, mentally processing the tortured screams of agony emanating only a few feet before him. Leslie felt a hand on his shoulder and the soft sound of someone speaking his name. Leslie turned to see his childhood friend, still somehow in his child form, blood leaking from a serrated fleshy hole in the left side of his face. Leslie was taken aback when the boy asked him,
"What are we gonna do, Les? It's your fault."
Leslie replied with a question of his own, not even knowing where the Inquisition had come from. "Where's Nate?" Leslie asked his friend.
"He's gone, Les. That doesn't matter anymore."
Leslie heard a noise behind him, from the direction of the vehicle. He turned his head slightly, just before he identified the glistening of a large, toothy blade that slammed down into his face. Leslie Chilton sat up in a cold sweat in his bed. He rubbed his face, more frustrated than anything by his reoccurring nightmare, and reached for his cigarettes on the nightstand beside his bed. He slid one from the pack, held it tightly between his lips, and used the nearby lighter to ignite the thin rice paper tube stuffed full of processed tobacco leaves and chemicals. Leslie reached up to the top of his head and scratched at his hair as he slid his body to the side, to now be sitting to the side of the bed, the lower half of his body only covered by an old pair of underwear and the corners of a couple loose blankets. Taking 2 drags, Leslie grabbed a bottle of bottom-shelf whiskey and poured a liberal amount into an empty juice glass, also upon the nightstand beside an overflowing ashtray. Once full, he opened the drawer of the stand and retrieved a small prescription bottle. Dumping 2 small white pills into his hand, he threw them both into his mouth, swallowed hard, and chased them with the whiskey that he had poured for himself. "Breakfast of champions," Leslie snickered to himself sarcastically. Yesterday he wasn't too sure. He had thought about it for a while, but now he was more determined than ever. He would have called upon one of his friends from that day so long ago, but Leslie and Nate hadn't talked in nearly 2 decades, and Bob had blown his brains out shortly after high school. At the time, Leslie resigned himself to thinking that Bob was simply too weak to handle it. Now, Leslie found himself becoming weak as well. Leslie savored the taste of cheap whiskey still lingering in his mouth as he stared out the window to the world beyond. The environment strongly contrasting that of his dreams, having given way to winter a couple months ago. He figured that, because it was winter, the camp should be completely vacant. His mind was made up. Today, he would venture out to Locust Lake and visit a place he had personally sworn to avoid: the adjacent forest. Leslie parked his car at the bottom of a long, windy hill that seemed to have been skipped over by plows and cinder trucks. Pennsylvania doesn't use salt on their winter roadways, making the journey on snow-dusted roads all the more dangerous. Leslie had parked his vehicle at the bottom of the road, graded at a steep incline, mainly because the camp on the other side of the lake was closed for the winter. So was the access road. Besides, even if he had attempted to make the hill, the car undoubtedly wouldn't have made it, forcing him to park at the bottom anyway. Leslie stared up at the hill. He already had a plan for avoiding the locked gate and the negation of leaving footprints at the entrance. He would take the path he had taken all those years ago with Bob and Nate. Leslie would walk up past the camp's main entrance, onto an old logging trail that led up the mountain and above Locust Lake. From there, he would travel through the woods and down to the lake's shore on the other side of the now vacant campground. The temperature was bitter cold, and the gust of wind didn't make it any warmer. Leslie shrugged his shoulders as he shut the driver's side door. The bottle of whiskey in his left hand would have to be enough to keep him warm. Leslie took long chugs off the bottle as he trekked his way up the slope of the mountainside on the windy dirt road. It took him the better part of a half an hour, but the influences of the cheap whiskey had made the time go by that much faster for him. Leslie approached a sign on the left up ahead. He expected to read Locust Lake, with an arrow pointing left. But as he neared it, he noticed it was a different sign, larger and colored differently. Leslie chuckled to himself when he read the new name. Just a gosh darn camp. Ha! If only a simple name change could wipe the memories away, Leslie thought to himself. For him, this place would always be Locust Lake. Leslie looked up the hill to the left, also expecting to see a house. Although he did indeed see one, it was much too close to the road to be the home he remembered, and it was much smaller than the home he was recalling to the forefront of his mind. They must have torn it down, Leslie spoke out loud to himself as he turned his attention back to the road and continued on past the sign. He had always heard rumors in town about the Treagles, where they'd gone or why they had left their house. Even talk of newcomers taking the property over, building a campground on the lakeshore, and even tearing down the old Treagle house. Leslie took another long pull from the plastic bottle, nearly gagging it back up with a cough. Desperately trying to suppress the images of his past currently surfacing to consciousness. His attempts were futile. However, it didn't stop him from killing the entire bottle by the time he had entered the woods on the left side of the road, far up the road past the sign. Leslie trudged through the snow. No trail to mark his way. Maybe it was the passage of time, the excessive consumption of alcohol, or a combination of the two. But one way or another, Leslie found himself a little confused as to where exactly he was. He thought he had gone up the mountainside far enough before making a left, and assumed he would come to a clearing that he would recognize within a few hundred yards, much as he did years prior. What he didn't know was that he had failed to travel up the slope far enough before making his way east across the mountain's ridge. He was now lost and very drunk. Most people in his position would have likely began to panic, but Leslie had reached a state of apathy. Wandering through the woods, figuring he would either find the place or freeze to death, believing at that moment that he really didn't care which. He was pretty much wandering aimlessly until he came across something on the snow-covered ground of the desolate forest. Footprints. He could see no cabin or structure in sight, no signs of another person, other than the tracks in the snow, and they were nearly covered over, signifying they had been made hours, possibly a day earlier. Curious and inebriated, Leslie got it in his head to follow the tracks to see where they led. Maybe they would lead him to the lakeside. Leslie followed them until they simply stopped at a snow-filled hole in the ground. The very large hole that, upon further inspection, was discovered to be the decrepit foundation of a building long since rotted away. That's what Leslie had thought until he caught notice of the patches of charred black on the stone blocks, mostly covered in a blanket of white snow. Even a drunken Leslie realized that whatever building stood erected in this spot had surely burned to the ground. Leslie remembered an old limerick regarding the ghost of an old orphan boy that had drowned in the lake just before an orphanage burned down back in the late 20s or 30s. How many seconds can you take, holding your breath at Locust Lake? 5. The orphan boy is at the bottom. 10. He's dead and rotten. 15. He's creeping up. 20. You're out of luck. 25. Right beneath your feet. 30. Pull you down beneath. Casper, Leslie blurted to himself out loud. That was his name, Casper Stoical. He chuckled to himself as tragedies of his past came flooding back. The faint presence of tears in his watering eyes soon replaced his self-chuckling. Leslie didn't need a legendary monster to scare him. Leslie was the monster. He had killed a boy his age on this very mountain when he was only 15 years old. He covered it up. He never told anyone. But it didn't matter. Leslie knew, and that guilt ate up his insides like a cancer. The same disease, the grief and guilt, had gotten to Bob as well, having sure been the reason he decided to blow his brains out. Leslie hadn't seen or spoken to Nate since nearly that day. He couldn't help but wonder to himself how Nate was, if Nate was able to deal with it, able to deal with the truth about Jacob's death. Leslie moved onward, understanding now that the lake itself was only a little further east. He never turned around to notice the extra set of footprints in the snow that had apparently belonged to someone stalking him in absolute silence. Leslie Chilton neared the frozen shore of the lake and made a right towards the cabins and the camp. As he passed by, he marveled at the development of the place. None of this was there in the early 80s. Only a single house by the lake, close to where the main cabin now stood. Out of curiosity, Leslie peered his head inside as he passed it by. The interior was decorated like that of a hunting cabin or ranger's shelter. It was one story and differing from a ranger's cabin only by replacing a CB transmitter that hung on the wall with a telephone, and the crafted tribal decorations clearly were made by children and bought from the local flea market that runs every Sunday from Memorial Day to Labor Day each year. Decorations included cheap fishing poles hung in a way to make them seem more extravagant and expensive, 2 mounted fish, some hand-painted wooden masks, and a birdhouse, likely brought indoors for the closed season. After passing the cabin by, Leslie finally caught a trail that would take him right to his destination. As he followed the path upward, Leslie lost his unnoticed pursuer, who was now setting sinister plans into motion. Finally, nearly out of breath, Leslie had made it to the part of the woods where the tree bark seemed darker than that of the trees on the rest of the mountainside. Bob had told him years ago that he had come back to investigate the car that they had left flaming with a trapped Jacob inside. He had told Leslie that the car was indeed there, but the trunk was wide open, and that Jacob's body was not in it. Leslie remembered getting very angry with Bob, beating him until he lay crying on the schoolyard grass, then whispered to him that he was never to go back or talk about it again, or Leslie would have to take care of him. Leslie forced him to bottle up that guilt, a guilt that caused Bob to kill himself. Leslie recognized the spot. The dented tree had healed its wound, but still had a concave depression in the trunk at right about the height, given the tree's growth over the years, of where the bumper would be. This was the spot. But the car was gone. There was no trace of it, and he figured it must have been moved years beforehand. Leslie turned around to walk back the way he had come. He had only wished to visit this spot for some possible closure. He didn't get any. What he did get was the sight of something he at first thought to be the work of his imagination, brought on by alcohol or possible psychosis. Because what he was seeing wasn't possible. On the path, following in his tracks about 30 feet away, stood a tall figure in the woods. It was a man. He wore a long black coat and dark black boots. His hands were covered with gloves, and his face, framed by a black hood, was mostly hidden behind what looked like to be a torn piece of fabric tied around the diameter of the skull, dangling over the man's face, only to reveal 2 distant eyes, and a portion of what looked like to be a pale cheek. What froze Leslie to the bone, however, was a partial logo of something across the fabric, and as the man moved closer, the details of it became clearer, contrasted by the glistening white blanket of snow at both their feet. The logo was part of a picture depicted on Jacob's shirt the day he had died. The cloth covering the man's face wasn't torn or tattered. It was singed and burned in places. Who are you?" The man didn't answer as he approached a paralyzed Leslie. "This isn't funny. Who the fuck are you? Where did you get that shirt?" He was getting closer, nearly 15 feet away, when the word slipped past Leslie's lips. He didn't even mean to ask. It just kind of came out. Jacob? With that, the figure suddenly stopped, his eyes more detailed and easily seen, intently focusing on Leslie with a burning desire for mayhem. Leslie stood in place, unsure of what to do. "It can't be. You're dead. I killed you!" The monster's eyes grew wide behind the mask. He knew this was Leslie Chilton. It was then that the figure pulled the long blade of a pole saw attached to a broken handle from inside his coat, and broke out in a sprint towards him that Leslie realized that this was somehow Jacob Treagle. Either Jacob was a ghost seeking his revenge, or he had never truly died. But Leslie knew his fate would be worse than death if he had allowed Jacob to catch him. In his alcoholic state, Leslie was no match for Jacob. The figure caught his prey after only a few yards of pursuit. Gripped by the shoulder, Leslie spun around and began frantically fighting to get free, grunting and yelling at Jacob, and pulled the hand of the pole saw to the side, readying himself to plunge the blade deep into Leslie's anatomy. Leslie held up his arm and blocked the blow with it, causing a deep, rough incision on his arm. The adrenaline overcoming any subsequent pain, Leslie reacted by grabbing a hold of the blade by the handle. "I could kick your ass when we were kids, motherfucker! I'll kick it now!" Leslie screamed at his attacker. Leslie took a swing at Jacob as hard as he could and missed, because when he attempted to fling his fist through the air, Leslie took a stumble on the uneven ground beneath him, hidden by the snow cover. Jacob, having a hold of Leslie tightly, fell with him. Neither Leslie nor Jacob were fazed by the fall, but it did give an injured Leslie one last chance for escape. Ignoring the path he had taken, Leslie tore ass to the campground just down the hill, through the forest. Jacob, having already gotten to his feet, sauntered slowly after him. Leslie was bleeding profusely from his arm, his path underscored by a thick trail of crimson contrasted by that of the snow that it landed upon. Leslie tried opening the door to the main cabin before he discovered that it was locked. An emergency evident, Leslie broke the glass on the front door, allowing him access to the lock. Once inside, Leslie grabbed the wall phone, pushed talk, and dialed 911. He shakily held it to his ear, but heard nothing. Leslie hung up and pushed talk again. This time, when he placed the phone to his ear, he noticed a lack of dial tone. "They must have shut off the utilities for the winter," Leslie thought to himself on fearful disappointment. His attention didn't last long, as a hulking, dark figure dressed all in black broke down the front door, ripping it from its hinges, and stepped inside. Leslie turned once again to see Jacob, a nightmarish rage in his lifeless brown eyes. Jacob already upon him, Leslie had no chance to run. Leslie once again fought and clawed at Jacob, doing everything in his power to frantically escape his clutches. Jacob wrapped both gloved hands around Leslie's neck and began squeezing so hard, Leslie heard a small crunch noise in his throat as his eyes felt as though they would pop from their sockets. Losing consciousness, Leslie flung his hand out for one final swing, but lost momentum due to his waning consciousness and caught only a small hole in Jacob's fabric mask, forcing it to come free as Leslie's hand fell to the side. Jacob immediately let go of Leslie and covered his face as best he could with his gloved hand, his hood slipping off the back of his head as he went to turn away. Leslie had only caught sight of it for a moment, but had gained a detailed image in that short time. There was no way Jacob could have lived. There was no way he could be alive. The white portion of his face first thought by Leslie to be a cheek was actually bone. Jacob's cheekbone was exposed on the right side of his face. What was left of his skin seemed as though it had nearly melted over his left eye before congealing and forming scarred tissue in strings and strands. Jacob's right eye bulged from the skull and was clearly infected, or even necrotic, having turned a jaundiced yellow and being encompassed by only infected pus-filled muscle tissue that had never regrown its skin. Hair sprouted from the top of his head with short, thick white patches, similar to mycelium. Leslie took the only way out that he had and ran towards the window that he had peered into earlier. It wasn't a very large window, but large enough for the girthy adult body of Leslie to fit through it quite easily in a prone position. Without an iota of hesitation, Leslie shattered the window glass and leapt through it. Jacob watched his victim flee before turning his attention to the various decorations placed about the cabin. Eyeing one in particular, Jacob grasped a hold of a crude wooden mask and slipped it over his head. Leslie ran through the camp in a desperate attempt to escape from Jacob. He held one hand in the other to apply pressure to his wound. He was still bleeding quite a bit, and with the contrast of his blood upon the snow, he knew he wouldn't be able to hide anywhere. Leslie heard the door of the cabin smash against the cabin's side as Jacob swung the door open violently. He was a good distance ahead of Jacob and began to have hope that he would get away. He ran down the camp's driveway to attempt to get back to the access road where he had parked his car. Several times Leslie tripped over stones in the dirt road that were hidden beneath a blanket of snow, and every time his foot would catch one of these upturned rocks, he would fall roughly onto the frozen ground, knocking what air he had out of him. Leslie stumbled down the road and eventually came across the access road where his car was. He turned, but then stopped. His car could be seen in the distance up the road, but there appeared to be a large man between him and his vehicle. He squinted a bit. He was a bit dizzy from being out of breath and from the loss of blood, but he knew by the size of the person that this wasn't Jacob. He sighed in relief and then began to approach the man who was turned away from him, looking up at his car. "Hey, help me, please!" Leslie yelled to the man, but at first, the man didn't move. "Help me, please!" Leslie yelled again, as he moved toward the man as fast as he could. It was then that the large man turned slowly around to face Leslie, whom then stopped dead in the snow. The man was very tall and wide. He wore black underclothing that was dirty and covered in ash and burn holes beneath which a graying, glistening skin could be seen. He also wore a faded, tan-colored coat that was also covered in grime and scorch marks, and atop his shoulders was a black hood of sorts with a hole for an eye, while the other eye was stitched with a dirty brown X and the mouth was stitched with an asymmetrical stitchwork with the same rope that was used to stitch the X in the eye. The entire body of this man was not only covered in scorch marks, but he also appeared to have patches of ice and snow that clung to him as if he had spent some time in the water and was now nearly frozen. "Shit!" Leslie said to himself, before turning to run through the woods toward the main road, where he thought maybe he could find help, if he could make it. As he ran from his new pursuer, a thought began to form in his head. Is this Casper? Is this Casper stoical?" Leslie trudged through the snow, and he could hear the sound of engines approaching. He continued to run, not looking back, and made his way toward the sound, moving off the road and into the forest beside it. He could see 2 snowmobiles approaching. The first snowmobile had 1 rider while the second had 2. He yelled for their help, but they couldn't hear him over the sound of their engines. Leslie ran and stumbled onto a path just before the first snowmobile. The rider noticed Leslie just in time and turned to avoid him. He narrowly avoided hitting him, but the snowmobile crashed violently into a tree. The driver was all right aside from a few scratches and bruises, but was pretty pissed off about wrecking his new snowmobile on the first time riding it.
What the fuck were you thinking?
The man screamed as he approached Leslie, ready to lay him out, but he stopped when he noticed that Leslie was bleeding and started to turn pale from the loss of blood in the cold.
Shit. Are you okay?
The man asked him. "We have to go," Leslie managed to say.
"We have to get you to a hospital."
A girl spoke. She was the passenger riding on the second snowmobile that had stopped safely. "We have to go now," Leslie said again. He wasn't making much sense to them, but they agreed. They had to go. They had to get him to a hospital.
I'm Pete, and this is John and Jenny.
The man that had wrecked his snowmobile said as he helped Leslie onto the back of the snowmobile behind Ginny.
Don't worry, man. You're gonna be alright.
He continued. "I'm Leslie," he said quietly as he looked at his 3 saviors, whom would look like scary people to anyone else. Aside from Ginny, they were covered in tattoos, especially John, who had several facial tattoos. Leslie didn't care. He just wanted to get out of here as fast as he possibly could. However, Leslie's relief would be short-lived. A scream came from Ginny as she watched a large man quickly approach Pete from behind, and Pete didn't have time to react before 2 large, bandaged hands gripped either side of his head and twisted it violently to the side. His neck broke and his skin began to tear as his head was twisted completely off his body. The man then held up the head and faced it toward the trio on the snowmobile, and Pete's dead eyes stared at them. And so did the eyes of the killer in the stitchwork mask. John instantly went full throttle on the snowmobile and took off in a panic. Ginny was crying, and Leslie was holding on to her with what little strength he had left.
"Who the fuck was that?"
John yelled back at Leslie. "Casper," Leslie said quietly, being nearly drowned out by the engine.
"Who?"
John yelled. "Casper Stoical," Leslie replied. John began.
"Are you fucking kidding me?"
He yelled back at Leslie, realizing how ridiculous that sounded.
"He ripped Pete's fucking head off. Who the fuck else could it be?"
Ginny yelled at John, still in panic. John followed the path quickly to get away from Casper, but Leslie soon realized that the path was heading back toward the camp. "We can't go this way! We can't go back there!" Leslie yelled at John.
"What?"
John yelled back at him. "We can't go back to the camp! Stop!" Leslie yelled, but John didn't listen, and it wasn't very long before they were back at the edge of camp. John sped through the camp and back toward the access road that Leslie had come in on. It was when the 3 of them approached a group of trees near the edge of the lake that things went from bad to worse. John saw a flickering light from the tree to his left just before he felt a sharp pain in his stomach, and all 3 of them were flung from the snowmobile that continued on through the field without them. They landed hard on the ground, and wood could be heard snapping as they fell. Leslie felt a new pain in his side as he looked down to see a new wound, to which he immediately applied pressure with his wounded hand. He crawled toward John and Ginny to see if they were okay, but he soon found that they were not. The 2 of them now laid on the snow-covered ground, writhing together and bleeding profusely from their abdomens. They had what appeared to be a wooden pole sticking through them, broken off at either end, and nearby, Leslie noticed the broken off end of a pole saw. This is what surely had cut his side. Someone had used a pole saw like a spear and had shish kebabbed them off the snowmobile. Leslie then slowly looked up to see the one that was responsible as he stepped out of the patch of woods. He saw the man in black clothes who now donned a crude-looking wooden mask. It was Jacob. Leslie quickly stumbled to his feet before falling again and rolling down the embankment toward the frozen surface of the lake. Jacob slowly walked down the hill toward Leslie, like an animal stalking its prey, as Leslie attempted to move out onto the frozen surface of the lake, hoping that the ice would be thick enough to hold his weight, and with any luck, be thin enough to not hold Jacob's. Leslie lured Jacob out onto the frozen water as far as he could before he witnessed a shocking sight. The broken end of the pole saw blade ripped through Jacob's stomach before slicing violently upward, ripping a large hole in Jacob's torso and covering Leslie in a putrid mess of pus and nearly black, coagulated blood. Leslie nearly vomited in disgust as he watched Jacob turn around to find Casper standing behind him. Jacob then quickly pulled the pole saw blade from his own stomach the rest of the way through, blade and then handle passing completely through his midsection before raising it above his head and plunging it into the thick, rotting neck of Casper. Casper reached out with one massive hand and clutched it around Jacob's throat, curling his fingers into Jacob's melted flesh. His grime-covered digits dug through the skin of Jacob's neck, blackened, coagulated blood gurgling out from around his fingers. Jacob pushed his gloved hands into previously made wounds in Casper's chest, pulling his flesh apart, causing his useless, decaying organs to be exposed amongst the thick globules of coagulation. Bones cracked and crunched. Skin split and tore. The two of them continued to fight, trying to kill one another like two wild beasts, like a wolf fighting a bear. Leslie decided this would be a good moment for him to make his escape, so he continued to crawl away toward the edge of the lake, but he quickly stopped after hearing the sound of cracking as the ice began to spiderweb beneath him. Before Leslie even knew it, the ice split and fractured, and he was dropped into the freezing waters of the lake. He lost his breath and fought and clawed at the edges of the ice around him, and at first, he couldn't get a grip, but after fighting desperately to get out of the water, he finally found a grip and was able to pull himself to relative safety. The cracks in the ice spread through the lake, and soon Leslie wasn't the only one in cold water. Jacob and Casper also fell into the murky depths of the freezing lake. The two of them struggled against the ice as Leslie did, but then suddenly they appeared to be yanked violently beneath the surface of the water, leaving only waves in the rippling behind them. Leslie was able to find enough strength to pull himself up out of the water and onto the ice, where he turned to the opening that he had just climbed out of, fearing that one of these two monsters would soon emerge from the dark hole in the ice to finish him off. All was silent for a moment as Leslie was frozen in terror, not knowing what to do. But after a while, he sighed in relief. They were gone. They had sank to the bottom of the lake, and they were finally gone. Leslie climbed slowly to his feet to make his way back to his car to get help. He was glad it was all over, and maybe now he could rest safely without having any more nightmares. It was all over. It was at that moment he felt a cold hand grip tightly around his left ankle. He screamed and struggled, trying to stomp his foot down upon the hand, but as he looked down, he saw it was not the hand of Jacob or Casper. Instead, it was a smaller, pale, white hand connected to an arm that curved down into the water, and there, beneath the freezing waters of the lake, was the figure of a woman. Her eyes were hollow and filled with an endless malice, her skin a pale white, with a bluish tint beneath the icy water. The woman in the water then gripped Leslie's ankle tighter, like a vice-like force, before she knocked him off his feet and pulled him down into the depths of the lake, where he watched the hole in the ice become smaller as he disappeared into the darkness of Locust Lake.
Well, if one killer doesn't get you, then the other will. And who knows, you may get lucky and just freeze to death. But if this story has left you with an unanswered question or two, make sure to drop by again and visit the lake shore. And until then, remember to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.